In the last section, section 8, we've talked about one way to influence the managers, the firm's behavior, and that was to sell your shares. There was somebody who was called the speculator, who got some inside information and could use this information in order to speculate, and then the share price moved up or down, and that was used as an incentive device to the entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur was motivated by the ability of shareholders to sell their shares. That means their exit option. In finance, there is something that's called, or is known as the Wall Street Rule. And that means the Wall Street Rule is that you have two choices, exit or vote. Exit means you can sell your shares, sell everything and get out as quickly as you can. And vote means you can raise your voice in the shareholders meeting and do something actively. And this is now what this section is about. So one could actually say that chapter 8 and 9 are both about the Wall Street Rule. Chapter 8 is about exit and chapter 9 is about vote. In other words, more academically speaking, investor activism. So investors that become active within their firm. And yeah, we will see a model. What about the role of investor activism? That's going to be, I would say, a little bit simpler than the model of section 8. But one thing that we will see is that in order to become active, you need at least some fraction of the shares. It cannot be tiny, infinitesimally small, but you need at least some minimum fraction of shares. And therefore, the question is, where do these shares come from? One possibility is that you have something like a two-step activism, that first you see there is a firm, but there is something wrong in the firm, so you want to monitor the firm. But in order to do that, first you acquire some of the shares in order to also benefit from your activism. So that is what this section 9.3 is about, emergence of share concentration. Where do concentrated stakes come from in the first place? And then two more extensions, 9.4, 9.5, that I'm going to talk about later. Okay, that's the plan for this section 9. So let's see. We start off with this model of section 3.2, like always. That's the basic starting point for nearly all of the extensions, fixed investment. But now we add a monitor who can intervene to reduce the scope of moral hazard. Okay, so the entrepreneur is still risk neutral as before. He has or she has wealth A as before. The project costs some I that's larger than A as before. So there's a financing gap of I minus A as before. Everything as before. Project yields are as successful, zero otherwise. Success probability PH, and there's this delta P. Now, this additional assumption, if there is monitoring, then the shirking leads to a private benefit of lowercase b, which is smaller than the uppercase b. And in the absence of monitoring, shirking still leads to the private benefit of uppercase b. So this is a point where one should stop and pause a little bit, like always. When there's a new assumption, one should always pause and try to think, what do you think about this assumption? How would you typically have defined monitoring? Here it is defined. It's like a leash, a dog's leash that you have for the monitor. You kind of just restrict the action space of the monitor. We will talk more about this interpretation in a bit, because we will first start with the traditional model without monitoring, discuss it, and then introduce the monitoring option. Okay, what is if we don't have monitoring? If the monitor whom we will also discuss later, decides not to monitor at all, then everything stays as, I mean, if there's the option to monitor, but the guy does not monitor, then everything stays as before. So incentive compatibility is as in section 3, pledgeable income decision as in section 3, break-even condition, entrepreneur's utility as before. So all the results are known from section 3.2 already. Okay, and now here the idea is that monitoring reduces the extent of moral hazard. So reduces the benefits from shirking from uppercase B to lowercase b, but you have to spend some C, which is larger than 0. So one can think about, one can think of it like originally the entrepreneur has 3 options. One option is to work, shirk 1, and shirk 2. Oh, this is not beautiful handwriting. Try again. Here, this looks better. So if he works, he has a success probability of PH. If she shirks, she has success probability of PL and gets the benefit of lowercase b, or with the other option, she gets even a higher benefit of uppercase B. And our monitoring just means that the third option is crossed out. That doesn't exist anymore. So instead of having 3 doors that the entrepreneur can go through, she only has 2 doors that she can choose. But in order to close that door, you need to do something, and that's costly, and that costs C. Okay? It's very rather important to try to think about this microstructure, how exactly we think about monitoring, because later on when we have modeling choices, it has to be consistent in a way to the way we understand modeling, monitoring, because otherwise there might be open questions. Okay, now let's come to the discussion. So we've stopped. Before that was we were in part 1 of the model, modeling, explaining the model itself, and now we come to part 2 of the model analysis and the equilibrium contract. Well, the monitoring, or rather the entrepreneur, is going to work if and only if, as before, delta P times RB has to be larger or equal than B. If we have monitoring, under monitoring, delta P times RB has to be larger or equal than lowercase b. Well, we can assume without loss of generality that delta P times RB is lower than uppercase b, because otherwise monitoring would not be necessary in the first place. Okay, and then why spend the additional cost of C if there is no benefit in monitoring? If the entrepreneur takes the most wanted option anyway. Okay, now let's talk about the monitor, because actually what we do have is a double moral hazard problem. Not only the entrepreneur needs to be incentivized, but also the monitor needs to be incentivized. Okay, so also the monitor needs some kind of incentive scheme. So let's assume, because there are only 2 different options, that let's assume that he receives RM for monitor in case of success and otherwise nothing. So why does the monitor only receive a reward if the project is successful? Well, that's because, well, we will see that it can be an equilibrium outcome, but the fact whether he's monitoring or not is not observable to the public. So the contract cannot be made contingent on whether he has monitored or not. So therefore, his contract can depend only on the project success, even though he's not responsible for the project success. At least he can help by monitoring the entrepreneur and thus making the deviation, the shirking, more expensive for the entrepreneur. Okay, so there will be sufficient incentive for monitoring if pH times Rm is larger or equal than PL times Rm plus C, or we could subtract also the C on the other side, or equivalently we could write delta P times Rm larger or equal than C. There is a little bit of storytelling behind that, or microstructure or microfoundation, one could say, and that is that if the entrepreneur is not monitored, then he knows, and as a consequence, he's going to shirk, and as a consequence from shirking, the probability of success is going down to PL. That depends, of course, on the more or less implicit assumption that monitoring is, at least to the entrepreneur, it is observable. So he knows whether he's watched or not. In reality, that doesn't have to be the case. If, for example, as a monitor, we choose somebody who is checking the books ex post, then the monitor does not know ex ante whether he's going to be controlled or not. So then the equilibrium will look a little bit different. In fact, it's going to look very interesting because in such a game, if the entrepreneur knows that he's going to be monitored, then there is no incentive for her to shirk. Thus, there's nothing for the monitor to find in the books, so he's not even going to check the books, and as a consequence, the entrepreneur is then he does not have an incentive to monitor, and then therefore the entrepreneur is going to shirk. So therefore we have a vicious circle, and as you already know, in those cases, in these vicious circles, very often we get mixed strategy equilibria, and that's something that we want to avoid here. So therefore we have slightly different assumptions. Okay. Now we have one additional assumption, and that is that the monitor himself is rich. So we assume for now, we will change that later on, that the monitoring capital is not scarce. So he can pay for the stake that that he gets. Okay. And therefore, we can ask ourselves, what's the amount of money, the maximum that the monitor would be willing to pay? Well, we could set up this break-even condition. He's going to get pH times Rm in equilibrium. He has to pay the C, and that has to be equal to his initial investment Im, where this Rm at least C over delta P. C over delta P. It could be equal to C over delta P or larger or equal in C over delta P. Both would be possible. Okay, now let's just finish up. The uninformed investors, those that are not the monitors, so we now have two groups of investors, the monitor and the other investors. One could call the monitor smart money because he does something in the firm. He's taken an active position. And the uninformed investors, we could call them dump money because they don't have any active position in the firm. So in the aggregate, we must have, let's see, the I minus A, that's the financing gap, minus IM, that's the amount of money altogether that the dump investors have to invest. And how much do they get back? They get back PH, because in equilibrium, the entrepreneur will work and not shirk. And then from the entire pie, RB is given to the borrower, RM is given to the monitor, so the rest remains. Okay. So remember from the slide before that PHRM is equal to IM minus C. Okay. So we have the PH times RM here, so we can enter that and subtract this IM on the other side, and everything that remains here is then the difference C. Okay, that's interesting because it means that we have to pay for this cost of C, but nothing in addition. So the monitor does not earn any rent, and as a consequence, well, that's kind of good news for the entrepreneur because the utility net present value is reduced by but not overly much. Okay, so there's no extra cost that has to be paid. Okay, PH times R minus RB is then what remains, and RB has to be larger than lowercase b over delta P. So this is the condition that we get. Before we had in section 3, we had a slightly different condition. Let me just write it up again. That was PH times R minus B over delta P had to be larger or equal than I minus A. So the question is now, is the pledgeable income condition relaxed or not? Under the blue condition, I'm going to get financing in the absence of monitoring. Under the yellow framed condition, I'm going to get finance in the presence of monitoring. So the question is, does monitoring help? And the answer is maybe, because on the one hand side, well, what do we have to compare? We have to compare this B over delta P with this B over delta P, and on the other hand, there's the C here. So both go into different directions. The C is adding to the financing gap, so that raises the financing gap. But on the other hand, the pledgeable part of the return is also getting larger. So the question is, which of both of the sides is reacting faster? Yeah, that will be on the next slide. But one more thing, just the last bullet point. Monitor stake RM can be chosen equal to C over delta P. It could also be larger. Here in this case, it doesn't matter. It has to be at least C over delta P, but it could also be larger because it cancels out in condition 9.8 anyway, as long as the participation constraint of the monitor holds. Okay, now if we assume that monitoring increases pledgeable income, well, that's an assumption. It doesn't have to be the case. And this thing here has to hold. In that case, monitoring increases pledgeable income. Now we can, and the second thing is that the entrepreneur does not per se benefit from having a monitor, because by choosing the monitor, the expected utility, the NPV of the project, goes down from PHR minus I to PHR minus C. So therefore, we can now think about different situations. If the entrepreneur would not get finance in the absence of a monitor, that means that the entrepreneur has a pledgeable income problem, and if she can increase the pledgeable income by choosing the monitor, then there is a trade-off. On the one hand, she has to take the monitor, pay C, that reduces the NPV, but it raises the pledgeable income, and then she can attract finance. Okay, so that's here, what's written here. Monitoring reduces the utility by C. So she will not choose the monitoring. Now here, either me or Tirole has forgotten the S. She will not choose monitoring if she doesn't have to. So if A is smaller than some A lower bar, which is defined as the minimum amount of inside equity that you need in order to attract finance even in the presence of monitoring. So you see here this A lower bar is defined, and there's the C and the lowercase b over delta p in it. Okay, and there is no funding at all. If A is larger or equal than A upper bar, and A upper bar defined as before, then there's financing even in the absence of a monitor, and then there is also some point in between where you can only attract financing if you have a monitor. Okay, so it's like a line here where you have the A underbar here, A overbar here. This is the possible A's. And if A is very large in this range, then you don't even need a monitor. If A is somewhere in the middle, like this range, then you can attract finance, but only with a monitor. And if it's even worse than that, in this pink region here, then you don't get finance at all, even if you have a monitor. Last sentence I want to say, and then we get to the first extension. What would happen, just think about what would happen if monitoring reduces pledgeable income? Well, in that case, if it reduces pledgeable income, then the monitor only has downsides. It's costly because you have to pay C, your expected utility goes down, and it reduces pledgeable income. So now remember that we have this we have two goals that we have to follow here. We have to maximize the NPV and at the same time make sure that pledgeable income is high enough. So therefore, two targets that we have to meet. So if there's some action that is negative in both directions, we're never going to choose it. And if there's an action that is positive in both directions, then we're always going to choose it. So therefore, the interesting things are only the ones where there is a trade-off. And that's the case here, because monitoring increases pledgeable income, but it reduces the NPV.